I'm just going to come out and say it. Second base is bad. Welcome into Fantasy Baseball today, and welcome to November. I am Frank Stampfl, joined by Scott White. You guessed it. Today on the show, second base year in review, and a look at Scott's early 2023 rankings at the second base position. We're recording this a little in advance, so we actually don't know what's going on in the World Series. I just hope the Phillies are winning. So let's go Phillies. Scott, before we started, you mentioned Movember. What do you say you grow a mustache for the month, huh?
How about no, Frank?
How about
No.
no?
Yes, I'm not going to do that. It would not. Nobody would enjoy that, Frank. Nobody at all. You would not like it.
I
I
disagree
would
with
not like it.
I
My
think I would
wife
love it.
would not like it,
Have you
which
ever
means I would
asked?
not like it. It would be bad.
All right. Anyway, how are the pitcher rankings going? I know you've been throwing up polls left and right on Twitter. I can't imagine ranking pitchers in October. It seems kind of tough. How's it going?
Oh, I think ranking pitchers this year is going to be tough no matter when you do it. It's just I mean it means that the position has become very deep, that it's hard to differentiate between the quality options at the top of the list. We've talked before, even when the season was still going on, how it looks like there's a clear top 7, but just distinguishing between those 7 is hard enough. When you get to number 8 through number like 32, it's just as hard in that range to sort out what order we should be drafting the starting pitchers. So yeah, it's been a headache. And it goes beyond that even. I mean, I would say now that I've had a chance to really dive into it, starting pitcher looks 60 strong, like 60 options that I feel really good about having in my starting lineup to begin 2023. And it's not like there's nobody good after 60. It's just 60 I feel really good about. So yeah, it's a position where certainly going to reverse course from the past couple seasons targeting starting pitchers early. I think I'm going to go back to the more traditional approach to fantasy baseball, the one I long held, really loading up on hitters early. And as we've talked about with these early position recaps / previews, emphasizing position eligibility within the hitter pool. I think that's the more I look at these, the more I look at how that pool is shaping up, the more I think that's the way to go in 2023.
For anyone who's watched or listened the past couple of years, you'll remember that Scott was adamant the past couple of seasons to get 5 or 6 of his top 30 or 35. But the landscape in fantasy baseball has changed. I'll be interested to know once we get to starting pitcher, we've got some time before we get there, how many of those top 60 you are aiming to get in drafts. But as I mentioned, we'll get to starting pitcher in a couple of weeks from now. But let's jump into second base. Obviously, we're going to recap the top 10 from this past season. And I can tell you by the time we get to like 6 or 7, it's just who are we even talking about? There was a lot of injuries at the position. I will say that Jazz Chisholm, Ozzie Albies, Brandon Lau, Jorge Polanco, Ketel Marte, Jonathan India, those guys will still be ranked relatively early for next season. But yeah, obviously that killed the production in 2022. Scott,
and the position is losing Trey Turner. It's losing Mookie Betts, who only gained eligibility at second base late in the year, but still, it's losing Mookie Betts for the start of next year. It's losing Ty France. Let me see. It's losing Nico Horner to whatever extent that matters. It's losing Javier Baez. It's losing quite a few players, making what was already a thin crop even thinner.
So that brings me to my first question before we even get into the recap. Normally, Scott, I don't draft for position scarcity. I think that normally that's a way to almost pass up on more productive players just to avoid feeling uncomfortable, I guess, is a way to put it in your draft, But I think that I will target second base early for all the reasons that I mentioned. I mean, this position is really bad. And we do have some pretty strong names up top, but honestly, if you get past the first 5 or 6 rounds of the draft without a second baseman, I think you're probably going to feel pretty bad about whoever you get at
Well,
that.
yeah, and I mean the idea of position scarcity, it goes back to a time that a lot of people don't even remember in fantasy baseball because the juice ball era lasted for so long, and it leveled the playing field in terms of power so much that there wasn't a position that was that scarce really, except for maybe catcher, just because catcher is catcher. But across the infield, the positions were pretty balanced. And so there wasn't much need to play the position scarcity game for a span of over 5 years. And I pointed this out during that time as I was releasing my position tiers articles that I've been writing, for 15 years now, and continued to write them because it's a popular piece of content. But I didn't feel like they were as relevant as they used to be because the drop offs at positions weren't as extreme and weren't as where the drop offs did exist. They weren't as impactful. But I think we're getting back to a point. We're seeing it here at second base. We're seeing it. We're going to see it at third base. We're seeing it at every position to some extent, where when the drop off comes, it can be crippling. Like you're going to have a black hole in your lineup if you don't get on the right side of that. And I think the game of fantasy baseball is more interesting that way, but it's going to be jarring for a lot of people who don't have a memory of what that's like.
All right, so let's jump in. Scott already mentioned Trey Turner did finish as the highest rated second baseman this past season, but will not have second base eligibility. So let's move on to the next name who will be second base eligible next year. And that was Jose Altuve, who finished as the 19th overall player in Roto. He averaged 3.6 fantasy points per game. That was second at the position, but it was actually first if you don't consider Mookie Betts. Altuve was the 6th second baseman off the board last year with an ADP of 56. So did pay off quite a bit of value. He hit 300, 28 homers, 103 runs, 57 RBI, 18 steals. He led the position in runs and home runs. His 18 steals were his most since 2017. He had a total of 13 steals from 2019 through 2021. So this just kind of came out of nowhere, a running renaissance for Jose Altuve. And Scott, I can already tell you, much like Paul Goldschmidt, people will not be enthusiastic to draft Jose Altuve in the second or even the third round. I think we're going to see drafts where he falls to the 4th round and maybe even beyond that next year.
He's not falling by me. I can tell you that much. I thought it was ridiculous how much he was sliding even prior to this year. The disrespect Jose Altuve has gotten in fantasy, it really dates back to the cheating scandal breaking. I don't know if that's necessarily the reason for it, or if it was that decline in stolen bases that he's now reversed this past year, and at a good time, because if he's back to showing that willingness to running is going to become a lot easier next year, as I've pointed out, and we could see Jose Altuve maybe get back to being a 25-30 steal guy. I think it's in the realm of possibility. I'm not going to predict it, but I think it's possible for him again if the environment changes like I think it will. But leaving that off the table, just looking at what he did, what he's been doing the past couple years where he's gotten this disrespect in fantasy, it's been a very easy pick for me. And that's going to be especially true this upcoming year. Like, if you're drafting with me, he's probably not making it past round 3 because I'm going to gobble up that every time. You mentioned he was second at the position in points per game, but first if you eliminate Mookie Betts, which you should because Betts isn't going to be eligible next year. So let's just say Altuve was first in points per game among second basemen in 2022. The gap between him and number 2 at second base for points per game was bigger than at every other position except the outfield. The gap between Judge and number 2 in the outfield was bigger. But otherwise, Altuve and the number 2 second baseman, that's the biggest gap. And like I said, I don't see a lot of reason to doubt what he did. He's been certainly in the hitting stats, the stolen bases you could question, but again, the landscape's changing. So I don't think that's going to be so much of an issue for him either. I think he's going to be awesome again. And There's only 2 second basemen I feel comfortable saying that about in the whole player pool. So if I'm not getting Altuve, I'm getting Marcus Semien is the other one. That's going to be one of my top draft priorities this year because I really don't want to be left high and dry at this position.
And we'll get to Marcus Semien in just a bit, but I do want to wrap up on Altuve that he's been a top 30 overall player in Roto each of the past 2 seasons. So again, he's proven it year over year. Some people might look at the StatCast numbers. They're bad, but they've been bad. Nothing has changed. He's an extreme pull hitter. He puts the ball in the air, takes advantage of the short porch in left field in Houston, and he continues to be productive. Some people will point to the age. He's 33 years old in May next year. But again, he's still been extremely productive. So none of those things really matter much to me. I'm with you, Scott. I think I'm going to be drafting quite a bit of Jose Altuve. I've done one draft. I'm 1 for 1. I already got Jose Altuve in one of those. Second in at the second base position last year was last year. It's still this year, technically. Last season, I guess. Marcus Semien. You mentioned him. He finished 25th overall in Roto, 3.1 fantasy points per game. That was 6th at the position. He had an ADP of 30 last year, so actually did pay off a little bit of value based on where he was drafted. He hit 248, 26 homers, 101 runs, 83 RBI, 25 steals. Not quite a 5-category contributor because the batting average is meh, but certainly is a 4-category contributor. One of only 4 hitters to go 25-25 this past season. And speaking of the season, it was a tale of 2 seasons, basically, for Semien. The first 2 months of the season, he hit 199 with a 540 OPS. Final 4 months, 268, 25 homers, and 810 OPS. I kind of feel like we can trust who Marcus Semien is, Scott.
Yeah, and good for him because we were all doubting him at this time last year, coming off a career year in Toronto, and then I don't know that we knew yet that he was going to Texas, but that didn't seem like the best shift for him. And for the first couple months, it looks like we were right about that. But then he turned it on, as you pointed out. I believe he was one of just 4 25-25 guys.
Correct.
Yeah. So, and at the position where there's the least to get excited about, that makes it even more reason to be enthusiastic about Marcus Semien going forward. I do worry that that if the humidors are calibrated the same way moving forward, set to the same temperature, the same humidity that they were in 2022, that the slow starts could become the norm for Marcus Semien. It could become the norm for a lot of players. It stayed pretty cold throughout the league deep into May, and maybe that won't be the case every year. But at least in April, it should be pretty cold around the league, and the ball doesn't carry as well. It carries even worse when it's weighed down by those humidor settings. And for somebody like Marcus Semien, who doesn't hit the ball that hard naturally, it's a real obstacle to overcome. But just keep in mind next year, if it happens again, to stick with him because the final results should be good.
I mostly trust Marcus Semien at this point, Scott. You tell me if I'm overthinking this one. The only question I have is manager tendencies. So the Rangers as a team, they ran a lot under Chris Woodward the entire time while he was there. Their new manager is Bruce Bochy, who was with the Giants from 2007 to 2019. I don't know how relevant these stats are because obviously stolen base numbers are dependent on who you have on your team most of the time and your personnel. But during his time with the Giants, they ranked 24th out of 30 teams in steals. Does that matter at all? Do you worry about maybe Bochy not being as aggressive with the Rangers on the base paths?
I was with the Padres a long time before the Giants, and I recall him having some big base stealers during that time. But I don't even think it's worth looking into because, again, with the rule changes being put in place next year, I feel like you can throw out most everything you know about stolen bases. And I understand that's uncomfortable. You'd rather have a baseline expectation for what's going to happen for every player, but I think you're setting yourself up for disappointment by doing that.
All right, let's move on to the third best second baseman this past season. That was Tommy Edman, who will have second base and shortstop eligibility next year. He finished 47th overall. He averaged 2.9 fantasy points per game. He was the 13th second baseman off the board with an ADP of 114, so did pay off a lot of value in 2022. He hit 265, 13 homers, 95 runs scored, 57 RBI, 32 steals, basically identical to his 2021 season. So it kind of feels like we should know who Tommy Edman is, but I don't know, Scott. He's still kind of a hard player for me to figure out. He got moved down to the bottom of the lineup at points throughout the season. He was hitting ninth for a while. I feel like as streaky as Tommy Edman is, his floor is that he can get benched at some point. I don't know if that's fair or not, but I don't know. I still kind of have this worry when it comes to Tommy Edman. What do you think?
I think it's not totally unfounded, that concern. With each passing year, it seems less likely. But look, just by the pure hitting metrics, the ones that tell us whether a player is a good hitter or not, Edman isn't. And he's so versatile, and obviously there is that speed element that teams value, at least to some degree. Feels like he's stayed good enough as a hitter to stick in the lineup, but could that change someday? I mean, Nolan Gorman doesn't have a dedicated lineup spot right now. Now he's not going to be able to play shortstop like Edman mostly did down the stretch. So maybe just the fact that Edman can be their shortstop salvages it. But I don't know. No, I don't think it's totally unfounded, but I don't think it's a huge concern. I don't think it's reason to avoid Edman necessarily. I think the bigger reason to avoid Edman would be that he's mainly giving you stolen bases. And are you going to need him to do that as much next year? It's been the most sought after stat in 5x5 leagues for several years, but I kind of feel like that's going to change. And if it does the benefit of having Edman outweigh the downsides? And I'm not sure it does. So he's not going to be a high priority for me next year. I'll tell you that. There certainly comes a point where I would take him, but I'm going to guess somebody else's will take him sooner just because of that emphasis on steals that's existed for so long.
All right. Brandon Drury was fourth at the position, but we're saving him for third base. So let's move on to Andres Gimenez, who had a breakout season, 63rd overall in Roto. He averaged 2.8 fantasy points per game. He was one of the, I guess you can consider him a league winner. Yeah, I would. His ADP was outside the top 300. So some people might have even picked him up as a waiver wire ad, and he returned top 70 value. So he was really, really good. As I mentioned, career year, still just 24 years old. He hit 297, 17 home runs, 66 runs, 69 RBI, 20 steals. Obviously, you'd like for the counting stats to be better, but I feel like he was batting towards the bottom of the lineup for a large portion of the early season, at least. And then he finally got moved up. So maybe those numbers can improve, but he did exactly that. He improved. He lowered the strikeout rate quite a bit. He crushed lefties as a left-handed batter, 336 batting average, 887 OPS. I like the player quite a bit, Scott. I'm going to be interested to see what the cost is, but if it's reasonable, I could see being in on Andres Gimenez.
Yeah, he looks like a guy who could contribute in all 5 categories. I will note that he outperformed the StatCast metrics, but he did that as a 23-year-old. He had a near 2020 season as a 23-year-old while qualifying at the weakest position in fantasy. And I think that alone is a pretty strong endorsement for him. Like, just the idea of him getting stronger and developing in all the ways players develop. If he's already able to do this, even if it was maybe him playing a little over his head, I think there's a lot of reason to be hopeful for Andres Gimenez moving forward. And my favorite stat for him, actually, it has nothing to do with fantasy, but I feel like it's worth pointing out. Andres Gimenez, in terms of WAR, at least according to Baseball Reference. I actually haven't checked Fangraphs, but according to Baseball Reference, WAR, Andres Gimenez, 7.2 this year. Francisco Lindor's best WAR in all his years in Cleveland. Remember, Andres Gimenez came over to the Guardians in the Lindor trade. Lindor's best WAR in all his years in Cleveland, also 7.2.
That is pretty interesting. Actually, that's crazy. I'm looking at Fangraphs, and they had Andres Gimenez at 6.1, and for Lindor in 2018, he was at 7.8. So that's according to Fangraphs. Either way you look at it, the fact that Andres Gimenez was that productive that soon after the trade for Lindor, I mean, you know, at the time we all thought it was a crazy, like, what is Cleveland doing? This is a crazy trade, and you know, it turns out that Gimenez and Ahmed Rosario have turned out to be, you know, quality players at the major league level. Let's move on to fifth at the second base position. That was Gleyber Torres. He finished 77th overall in Roto, 2.7 fantasy points per game. He had an ADP of 179 before the season, so jumped up over 100 spots in value. It was a big bounce back season after two very disappointing ones. Gleyber hit 257, 24 home runs, 73 runs, 76 RBI, and 10 steals. You might ask yourself, well, why? How did this happen? First thing I noticed, Scott, and I noticed this very early in the season, he was much more aggressive. His swing percentage and his chase rate were both the highest since 2019. And normally, you don't want hitters to be too aggressive, but if you look at those type of statistics, the past 2 years, he was too patient, borderline passive at times. I don't really know what went into that, but yeah, it was something that I noticed for quite a while. And so he was aggressive and he hit the ball much harder than he ever did before. So can you see yourself being in on someone like Gleyber Torres next year?
Not really.
Oh.
I mean, not that I'm going to be out. I think he can do this again. I think we're already beyond the point where you're talking a real game changer in fantasy, unless he ups his steals production. He had 10. I mean, that's obviously a pretty good total this year. I don't see him as a base stealer, but again, you kind of throwing out everything I know about stolen bases. So I'll at least keep an open mind on that front. It's encouraging that he regained some of the power he lost because he's going to need it. It's just he doesn't bring much to the table that I can see right now beyond a pretty good home run total, but not a great home run total. So it's just kind of a boring fallback option, I feel like.
And Gleyber did rank 40th percentile in sprint speed this past year. So he's not fast by any means, but the past 2 years, he's done a good job of picking his spots. I think he has like 24, 25 steals over the past 2 seasons. So I think you kind of just pencil him in for 10, but maybe based on the landscape next year, he can get up to 15 to 20, something like that. This is where things get interesting, Scott. Sixth best at the position this past year, Thairo Estrada, who played for the Giants. He finished 94th overall, 2.6 fantasy points per game. Basically was not drafted. He was someone who was picked up, I would say, relatively early on in the season. He hit 260, 14 home runs, 71 runs scored, 62 RBI, 21 steals. 14 homers, 20 steals, and that's a pretty productive player. I don't want to downplay what he did too much. He makes a lot of contact, just a 16.5% strikeout rate. Also hits a lot of ground balls. Doesn't hit the ball very hard. Is pretty fast, 75th percentile in sprint speed. Crushes lefties. Not good against righties, Scott. So I don't really know what to make of Thairo Estrada. And given the fact that he plays for the Giants, it would not surprise me if he becomes a platoon player at some point.
Yeah, he's been a tough one. He was a tough one to figure out all year. He got picked up so quickly that we never much talked about him. He wasn't on anybody's radar coming into the season, and then he got scooped up so quickly that he was kind of rostered beyond the point where we talked about him much on the podcast during the season. Yeah. But it was surprising how useful he ended up being. I don't see a lot of upside here, and as you point out, he could run into playing time issues. I think part of the reason he ended up ranking so high is the number of second base eligible players who either underachieved or got hurt. So I don't even have him in my top 20 going into next year. I'm not saying there's no point in drafting Estrada, but it would have to be late as like a middle infield option in a roto league.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I was going to pull up some very early ADP just to see where he's going, but it's taking me quite a bit of time. So I'm just going to move on, and maybe I'll come back to it here and let you know what's going on with Thairo Estrada. These next two, Scott, I'm going to put together 7 and 8 at second base. Jeff McNeil and Luis Arraez. And you could probably guess why I'm putting them together, because they are
they're
very
the same
similar.
guy.
Yeah, it's the Spider-Man meme all over again. Jeff McNeil finished 98th overall in Roto, 2.7 fantasy points per game. Luis Arraez, 108th overall in Roto, 2.8 fantasy points per game. So even by those metrics, they were very, very similar players. McNeil hit 327. He led the National League. He actually led all of baseball in batting average. He won the NL batting title. Luis Arraez hit 316. He won the American League batting title. It was 9 homers for Jeff McNeil, 8 home runs for Luis Arraez. You look at their lack of power, 128 isolated power for Jeff McNeil, 24th lowest among qualified hitters. Luis Arraez in that same stat, 104. He was 12th lowest. So I feel like if you draft these guys, Scott, it has to be in a very particular roster construction where maybe you just took a bunch of sluggers and you need to improve your batting average, but outside of that, it just does not really move the needle for me whatsoever.
Well, and yet they finished 7th and 8th at this position in roto leagues last year, which I think
they were both top 110 players,
But we're talking about guys who don't contribute power, who don't contribute speed. Both of them for part of last year were platoon players. And yet they finished 7th and 8th at this position, according to our roto formula, which, I mean, it kind of sums up the state of second base. I do like them more than Thairo Estrada for next year, but yeah, they're kind of category specialists. And when I wrote it, if you go look up my early second base rankings on the site, I wrote up the top 20, and McNeil rounded it out. He was number 20, but it could have been a rise, and I address it there right in the article that they're basically the same guy. The reason I gave McNeil a little bit of an edge is because he seems like less of a platoon risk. He's not as bad against same-handed pitchers as Luis Arraez is. And McNeil's secondary eligibility is the outfield, while Arraez is first base. So outfield's more useful than first base. And you'd be more likely to play McNeil at that second position than you would Arraez at his. So yeah, that's how I rank them, but we're talking about rounding out the top 20 as opposed to being in the top 10.
And even in points league, Scott, which you would figure is their better format because they make so much contact, they, walk a decent amount. Luis Arraez had more walks than strikeouts this past season. But even with that, 2.8 and 2.7 fantasy points per game, they're not necessarily standouts. They're fine. Yeah. They're high floor plays, but I think, especially in a points league, they're someone you would take later on, and you're not expecting much upside. So again, it's just not really excited to draft either one of those guys. I did pull up the Razzball player rater, Scott. So they have their own 5x5 algorithm, and they weigh out and value the players as well. They have Jeff McNeil at 110th and Luis Arraez at 114. So not dissimilar from where they rank on CBS 5x5. But yeah, either way, they were both top 115 players regardless. The 9th best second baseman this past season was Jake Cronenworth. He finished 109th overall, averaged 2.7 fantasy points per game, had an ADP of 121 before the season. So gave you a tiny bit of profit based on where you drafted him. 240 batting average, 17 homers, 88 runs, 88 RBI in 158 games. Jake Cronenworth, to me, Scott, has become the poster child of a volume play where he just accumulates these counting stats because he plays every single day, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I just don't know how good of a hitter he actually is on a per game basis for fantasy purposes. I noticed an interesting progression in his career. He came up as a contact hitter in the shortened 2020 season. High line drive approach. StatCast actually loved him in the shortened season, but now he started to sell out for power. So his fly ball rate has gone from 29% to 36% to 48% this past season. And his OPS has gone from 831 to 800 to 727. So you just see how those things almost
Yeah.
directly correlate for Jake Cronenworth. I think he's fine. I don't know that he offers much upside either.
Well, he hit 21 home runs in his first full season last year. And I think, as you point out, looking at that escalating fly ball rate, he kind of became home run conscious, and he kind of sold out for them, like you said. And that's, I don't think that's going to be a winning formula with the ball being in use now, with the humidor being in use now. He probably is better off lowering that launch angle, getting back to being a line drive hitter, maybe turning out to be something like Jeff McNeil and Luis Arraez, contributing more in batting average than power. So I don't think we know exactly who Jake Cronenworth is yet. But if he remains this, then yeah, he's kind of a batting average liability who helps enough in the counting stats just because he plays so much. And I don't see that changing. But again, we're talking about a pretty boring option overall.
And to that point, Scott, if Fernando Tatis Jr. is healthy next year and plays a majority of the season, these counting stats could be even better for Jake Cronenworth. I kind of wish he would blend this new approach with what we saw in 2020. Maybe don't completely sell out for line drives and being a contact hitter, but maybe like a 270 with 15 homers, really good counting stats. I feel like that would wind up being a more productive player, but I do agree. I think it's kind of hard to figure out like who is the real Jake Cronenworth at this point. Number 10 at the position was Josh Rojas, who actually played most of his games at third base, but let's just include him here, Scott, because I really don't want to go much further down the list. He finished 114th overall in Roto, 2.8 fantasy points per game, had an ADP of 281 before the season, so actually turned out to be quite valuable on the season. And he hit 269, 9 homers, 23 steals in only 125 games. That is a 11 homer, 28 steal pace over 150 games. Really strong plate discipline, Scott. He's always walked a lot, over 10% walk rate in his career. Got his strikeout rate down below 20%. Hits a lot of line drives. Hits the ball relatively hard for a middle infield eligible player. I think he's fine. I think he's kind of interesting. Solid batting average, good plate discipline, maybe 10 to 15 homers and 25 plus steals. That's a valuable player and probably better for roto and category leagues.
I'm going to say something that may sound contradictory, given how much I've talked about the stolen base landscape changing next year, but I don't trust Josh Rojas to steal 23 bases again. And if he doesn't, I don't see a lot else going on there. So I'm definitely going to be fading him next year. He only has 50th percentile sprint speed. He hadn't shown much base stealing prowess prior to this year. By the end, at different points during the year, including toward the end of the season, he wasn't an everyday player for the Diamondbacks. And I just don't see a lot to like here. So Josh Rojas he ranks behind Thairo Estrada for me going into next year, which means he's not in my top 20 at this position.
That is interesting, considering he plays the two most shallow positions, right? Second base and third base. 15 of his 23 steals came in the second half. That's pretty impressive, Scott. I mean, 15 steals in 62 games. I know that he hasn't done it before, but the Diamondbacks are really aggressive on the base pass in the second half, and I think that's going to be their MO moving forward too.
The other thing you have to consider is, does he stay in the lineup?
Yeah, he was
like he doesn't look like a championship piece, and I'm not saying the Diamondbacks are a championship team, but like they're bringing in a lot of young guys. They're who was playing third base for them by the end? Primarily, I think it was that guy they got from the Royals, who's no big deal.
Emmanuel Rivera.
Yeah.
That's the thing, Scott. Is I don't really see. Is there a player that's going to come in and prevent him from playing? I just don't know.
I don't know that there's going to be. Okay, so first of all, if Ketel Marte is healthy, he's second base, obviously, and
And he is a
short
better second baseman than outfielder. So
shortstop is. Well, at some point it might be Jordan Lawler anchoring that spot, and if it does become Lawler, then hang on here, pulling up shortstop. Okay, so it was Geraldo Perdomo primarily playing shortstop. I don't know. Like I'm not saying Rojas is just going to become a straight up bench guy, but I see him. It's kind of another John Birdie situation where there may be stretches where he's an everyday player, there may be stretches where he's not. And if somebody better comes along, I don't think the Diamondbacks will hesitate to kind of brush him aside.
Okay. I think he's a better hitter than John Birdie. I mean, just in terms of like the plate discipline that we've seen so far, at least. But I get it. I mean, I guess I could see both sides. He did struggle mightily against left-handed pitching this past season. He was better against them in previous seasons, so maybe this is an aberration. But we'll see what happens with Josh Rojas. Let's take a break. But before we do that, just want to remind anybody who is watching us to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Drop a comment. Definitely would appreciate that. Let us know who you're going to be drafting at second base next season. And for those listening, please hook us up with a 5-star rating and a review on Apple or Spotify, no matter where you listen. Let's take a break and we'll get to Scott's early 2023 rankings here on Fantasy Baseball Today. The 2023 rankings for second base. Let's start with the top 5 at the position, and it should not surprise anybody that number 1 is Jose Altuve, followed by Marcus Semien, Ozzie Albies, Jazz Chisholm, and Trevor Story. So 3 names there, Scott, that we have not talked about yet in this podcast, and ones that we definitely need to talk about starting right now because they're all very valuable players when they're on the field. Trevor Story, Jazz, Ozzie Albies, they all dealt with differing injuries this past season, but were extremely limited, especially Albies, just so unlucky. I mean, he fractured his foot in June. He came back. He's ready to be a part of the postseason run, and then he fractured his finger in September. I mean, frankly, it's just bad luck. He was pretty disappointing before that, so I will point that out. But each of the past 3 full seasons before this year, he was a top 45 player in each of those. So Ozzie Albies is a weird hitter, Scott, where he doesn't really rank highly in like OPS or weighted runs created plus, like these all-encompassing hitter stats, but he just has enough power and speed to find a way to get by and be valuable. So I think I'm going to be in once again on Ozzie Albies. What do you think?
Yeah. What I think is going to happen though, and I don't know if the little bit of drafting you've seen or done backs this up. It could be that just Albies is a forgotten man because he missed so much of the year, and that tends to happen with these early mock drafts. But I kind of get the feeling he's going to be drafted ahead of Jose Altuve just because of that seeming bias against Altuve and the widespread preference for younger guys. I mean, Ozzie Albies, he's still only 25,
Yeah.
And the 25-year-old, he'll be 26 at that point versus the 33-year-old Altuve. I mean, I think some people are just going to not make it much more complicated than that. Oh, I want Ozzie Albies. He's the guy with upside. I don't think he really has much room to improve over who he's already been, but I think a lot of people will look at that way. And if that's the case, there's no way I'm drafting any Ozzie Albies, But if it plays out like my rankings and Ozzie Albies is the 3rd second baseman drafted behind Altuve and Semien, then I'd be fine taking him. You did mention that he hit only 247, had only a 703 OPS. Those were not very good. Those were both career lows. However, he fractured his foot in the middle of June. So most of the season that he did play came during those coldest months where everybody was struggling. And he is a guy who doesn't hit the ball very hard and who puts it in the air a ton. So he has that exact sort of profile like Marcus Semien that would struggle in those environmental conditions. So I presume that if he got a full season, he got to play when it was warmer, that his numbers would have corrected like Marcus Semien's did.
5 drafts have been done over on the NFBC so far, Scott. Ozzy Albies ADP is 38.4. Jose Altuve is 46.2.
Yeah, if it's already happening, I think that's going to keep happening.
Well, here's my only argument for Ozzy Albies, Scott, is that we just saw a pretty great season, from an elite season from Jose Altuve. He was a top 20 player. He finished 19th overall in Roto. Ozzy Albies was better in his last full season. 2021, he was 16th overall. So you can argue that his upside is higher and he's the younger player. So I guess.
Yeah, he had a career high 30 homers that year. He had a career high 20 steals. So I don't know that he's ever going to be that good again. He scored 103 runs. He drove in 106. Like that, those are going to be hard numbers for Ozzy Albies to repeat. I think, just looking at it line item by line item, Jose Altuve, clearly the better batting average bet.
Correct.
I would say he's the better home run bet. Stolen bases, I'll give the edge to Albies, but not by much. That was his second most stolen bases in a season is 15, less than Altuve had this past year. So, yeah, I'd rather have Altuve.
It's close though. I think it's pretty close. I think you can argue the Braves lineup is actually better than the Astros. As good as the Astros are, right? Like Altuve had 57 RBI. Ozzy Albies, you mentioned, had 100 previous season. So we'll see. Yeah. It's pretty close between those two. Jazz Chisholm is 4th on this list, Scott, in your rankings, and he was off to a tremendous start. 254 batting average, 14 homers, 12 steals in 60 games. For whatever reason, 2 years in a row when nobody else is hitting, Jazz Chisholm is the one hitting. That is a 35 homer, 30 steal pace over 150 games. Can he play that many games? I don't know. He's dealt with a bunch of injuries the past couple of seasons. Stress fracture in his back this year. Also turned out that he had a torn meniscus, so he's got to come back from that stuff. He's got to prove that he could stay healthy. But he is a clear StatCast standout at this position, Scott. He crushes the ball. 90.4 exit velocity, 16.7% barrel rate. That's just not something you see from another second baseman.
Yeah, I'm in on Jazz Chisholm now. I was out on him last year. And, I'd still rather just get Altuve or Semien and be done with it, not have to deal with injury risks or performance risks or anything like that at the position. But if I had to settle for Chisholm, it wouldn't be the worst thing. My biggest concern with him now is just staying healthy. I'm not so concerned about performance anymore. He is one of the few second basemen who actually does impact the ball very hard, as you point out. And he's going to be one of the most prolific base stealers at the position. He does still strike out too much, but it's trending the right way. So I'm getting more optimistic about Chisholm's long-term prospects in fantasy when, for the most part, I've been on the negative side of the ledger until now.
Does it matter to you that he is awful against left-handed pitching? 223 batting average, 661 OPS in his career. It was somehow even worse than that in 2022.
Yeah, not really. I mean, left-handers against left-handers, you expect them to be bad. Yeah, I've seen worse, certainly. He's so young, he could get better, but it's not going to impact his playing time, which would be the main concern for me.
All right, the last name in this top 5 is Trevor Story, who only played 94 games, but did wind up hitting 238 with 16 home runs and 13 steals. That is a 25 homer, 20 steal pace over 150 games. And he's another player who got off to a really slow start. Obviously, coming over from Colorado and Coors Field, playing in a brand new environment, Fenway, Boston, new position, playing second base. I think it's easy to kind of give him a mulligan early on in the season, Scott. But once he started to get going, he kind of looked like Trevor Story. If we get a good discount on him, I'll be in. This is one where I could see, like, let's jump in on Trevor Story. I think he can get back to having an elite season.
I don't think he can get back to being elite myself. And let me see. So sometimes I remember my broad takeaways when I do these deep dives on players, but then I forget the specifics. So he had 9 home runs in May, but still hit just
218.
218 for the month. And then, even after May, obviously he missed a lot of time with injury, but after May, he still got 189 at bats. He hit 254, had a 731 OPS. Power's there, speed is there. It's not like he's a bad option, particularly at this position. But I do think it's safe to conclude, looking at this first year in Boston, looking at his final year in Colorado, that he's not much up in batting average anymore. He's going to be a liability in that category, if anything. Obviously, he's not going to get all the BABIP boosts that he got in Colorado. And the strikeout rate is climbing as well, which isn't going to help in the batting average. His expected batting average was 221, actually 17 points lower than his actual mark. So I don't see a stud outcome for Trevor Story anymore. Will there be enough home runs and stolen bases for him to be? I mean, look, I have him ranked 5th among second basemen for next year, so I certainly see that there's value there. But yeah, I think I don't think the stud outcome's on the table anymore.
All right, let's move through 6 through 10 in the rankings. We've got Tommy Edman, Andres Gimenez, Max Muncy, Ketel Marte, and Jorge Polanco. With Max Muncy, Scott, this was another tale of 2 seasons. First 4 months, he hit 161, 9 homers, 613 OPS. Final 2 months, 247, 12 homers, 858 OPS. He was basically Max Muncy. Was dealing with the elbow injury in the offseason. It could just be that it took him all that time to get healthy and get comfortable while playing with that injury. It seems like it would be a pretty reasonable explanation. And then the other 2 that we haven't talked about, Ketel Marte and Jorge Polanco, just completely hampered by injuries. Ketel Marte, he still played 137 games, but it just kind of felt like he was never healthy, constantly dealing with hamstring injuries throughout the season. Can you see yourself buying back in on any of those 3? Muncy, Ketel Marte, Jorge Polanco?
I think in points leagues, it'll be really easy to buy back in on Muncy. I mean, he's always been better in that format because the plate discipline's so good. The batting average, which can be kind of suspect, it doesn't hurt you in points leagues. So I'd be totally happy with Muncy in that format. I had a lot of concerns about his elbow heading into the year, him not having it surgically corrected, and those concerns seem justified for the first 2/3 of the season. But not only was the production back those final 2 months, Muncy's average exit velocity from August 1st on was 92.3 miles per hour. That would have been a career high if he'd done that over the course of the season. So I think he proved that his elbow is sound, and I expect him to be much better from start to finish next year. The others, Ketel Marte, Jorge Polanco. Did you mention the guy after them?
No, he's in the next group of 5, but
let's go ahead and mention him because I think it's a similar situation.
Yeah, it's Brandon Lau.
Yeah. So Marte, Polanco, Lau. Obviously, these were 3 guys who we thought were borderline studs coming into the year, and none of them came close to living up to that. Marte is the one that's most confounding to me because the StatCast numbers still look great. They've kind of always looked great for him. He hits the ball very hard. It seems like the sort of launch angle that should translate to power. And yet, since his 32 homer 2019 season, he's played 272 games since then and hit a total of 28 home runs. It's obviously not good power production. And The upside is apparent to me, and obviously in 2021, another injury-plagued season, he played only 90 games. He still delivered a 909 OPS. He hit 318. The power wasn't great, but it was good enough if he's going to hit 318, But just the lack of consistency, even though the underlying numbers say he should be better, it's hard to count on Ketel Marte for much. Like, if we get to this point in the draft and I don't have a second baseman yet, okay, shoot for upside, but I don't feel great about it. I actually think Jorge Polanco, like I see a clearer path to him recovering to his 2021 numbers than Marte, because it looked pretty fluky for him how he didn't produce more. And I feel like if I feel like if he hadn't got his season interrupted by injuries, because remember 2021 played out similarly. Through May, he was basically awful, and then he just went bananas over the final 2/3 of the season. I feel like if not for those injury interruptions, things would have played out better for Jorge Polanco. Maybe he would have rebounded. He still hit 16 home runs and 375 at bats. So, no, a lot of it was just the fact that the batting average was lagging, but he hit the ball as hard as before. His strikeout rate was still solid. He hits a lot of line drives. It feels like kind of a fluky thing for Polanco, and that better health would do a lot for him. The upside for Ketel Marte is higher, but I'm not going to say the downside is better for Jorge Polanco. It's just, I feel like he's more likely to reach his upside. I'll put it that way.
And the big talking point for Jorge Polanco going into last year is, how did he produce all of this power all of a sudden? He did it by hitting more fly balls and pulling the ball a ton, more than ever before in 2021. Last year, that came back a little bit, but he was still pulling the ball a lot, 49%. That's 43% for his career. So I agree, Scott. I mean, still hit the ball the same average exit velocity, similar hard hit rates, and was still pulling it quite a bit. It seems like everything is there for Jorge Polanco to get back on track if he can get healthy. And just to put a bow on these three, Ketel Marte, Polanco, Brandon Lau.
Yeah, I want to address Lau too, because I didn't get a chance to. But
I think this position is dependent on the health of those three, right? Like, we're only 11 deep, and we're already talking about how worried we are about these players. But if they can stay healthy, it's a big if, then they've shown what kind of upside they have in the past. So,
I mean, look, if they all bounce back to something like 2021, this position looks a lot better.
of course, yeah.
But it's, asking all three of them to do that, that's hard. And if you're just going to, okay, I'm going to draft one of these guys because I like the upside, well, you can't be sure you're going to pick the right one. And then what do you fall back on if it doesn't work out?
Yeah.
Of course, Brandon Lau hit 39 home runs in 2021, and everything he showed in his career up to that point made him out to be a big-time slugger. But then he hit in 2022 here just 8 home runs and 235 at bats. Now, he was dealing with a back injury. It came on early. He came back, and then it didn't hit very well, and then ended up back on the IL with that same back injury. So it's possible he was just plagued by that injury all season long and was never right, and so he deserves a complete pass. The biggest concern for Lau for me is that even when he was healthy, the Rays weren't playing him all that regularly, and that's the way they handle things. He's a left-handed hitter. Even if he's right, I'm not totally confident in the playing time.
All right, let's get to the top 15. We mentioned already Brandon Lau at 11. At number 12, we have Brandon Drury, followed by Gleyber Torres, John Birdie, and Jake Cronenworth. Birdie is the one we haven't mentioned yet. He led all of baseball with 41 steals. He also hit 240 with 4 home runs and a 662 OPS and a 93 weighted runs created plus. I think we know who John Birdie is. He's not a very good hitter. He can steal bases in bunches, which can help in deeper category leagues, but I don't think there's much there, Scott.
Yeah, I really don't know where to rank him. I don't want him. I know that much. Like, I've never been inclined to take the steal specialist anyway. That's going to be especially true with the rule changes taking effect in 2023. And Birdie seems like, even though he led the majors in steals by a good margin. He seems like a weaker bet to follow up on that than most stolen base specialists we've seen over the years, because he's 33 years old and the Marlins were kind of just backed into a corner playing him every day. Like, that's never the goal going into the season, to play John Birdie every day. So versatile that he tends to play a lot, but I don't think that's going to be by design heading into this year either. Where did he end up going in your mock, if you have that pulled up? Because if there's no appetite for drafting Birdie, then I've overranked him here, and I need to correct that.
He went in the 14th round of a 15-team league. That was just before Ty France, Ian Happ, Josh Rojas, Brendan Nimmo, Rowdy Tellez, Oscar Gonzalez.
It sounds like he was drafted pretty high then.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
We'll see. But I'm open to moving him. I'm going to move him to a point where I don't end up drafting him when all's said and done.
I think that's fair. Let's move to 16 through 20 in the rankings. That starts with DJ LeMahieu, Gene Segura, Brendan Rodgers, Jonathan India, and Jeff McNeil. DJ LeMahieu, another one on this list where it looked like he was bouncing back to not the same player we've seen in the past, because he had some truly elite seasons early on with the Yankees here, but he was bouncing back, and then boom, injury sapped it all away, and now we're back to what do we expect heading into next season? We don't exactly know with DJ LeMahieu. Gene Segura, I'm a little surprised by this ranking, Scott. It seems pretty low for him. He was good when he played. 277 batting average, 10 homers, 13 steals in 98 games. He does have a club option for $17 million, so perhaps the Phillies don't pick that up. But he was still really good. And you can't use the age argument, Scott, because he's going to be the same age as Jose Altuve.
Well, I mean, Jose Altuve's shown no signs of decline. I think Segura's been pretty stable the last few years, but he obviously hasn't been like he was in his prime. I'm going to guess they don't pick up that option, $17 million. And so that obviously throws his future into doubt. I could be wrong about that. I mean, maybe
I don't know either, actually. That's a close one. I've
Yeah.
seen some rumors linking Trey Turner to the Phillies, just early rumors, but who knows?
Yeah. I mean, he's pretty boring.
Oh, you don't like a good batting average with 15 homers and 20 steals, Scott? Come on.
I mean, 277. It's helpful. It's not.
Good.
It's not. He's just kind of like a little above average at everything,
I like Gene Segura.
I know you do.
I always like Gene Segura, man. I took him.
I mean,
in
if
his
you want to
first
move
draft.
him ahead of LeMahieu, Cronenworth,
Yeah.
that's fine. But I feel like those two have more upside than he does. I am worried about LeMahieu though. I think he and Cronenworth are similar in terms of they optimize their swing for an environment that doesn't exist anymore, and so now they're kind of struggling to figure out what they're going to be. It's just Cronenworth's a lot younger, so he has more time to figure that out, and he's not dealing with diminishing skills the way LeMahieu might be. And also, the Yankees just introduced Oswald Peraza. They're presumably going to introduce Anthony Volpe at some point next year, and I could just see DJ LeMahieu if he's not doing any better than he has been the last couple of years. I could see him. Yeah, I could see his role being reduced.
I agree with that. I saw something on Twitter earlier that kind of made sense to me. Anthony Rizzo has a player option, which I think he's going to opt out of. And if the Yankees choose not to bring him back, they can just move DJ LeMahieu over to first base full time, which is not very exciting from a Yankee perspective.
I mean,
but
the Yankees media is talking about heads needing to roll, and if that's what they ultimately decide to do at first base, I don't think that's going to satisfy anybody.
Don't get me started, Scott, on the Yankees offseason. Apparently, all the rumors are Aaron Judge is gone, but I guess we'll see. Last couple of names here on the list. Brendan Rodgers, 18th overall. He's still young enough where I guess he can progress, but he just kind of feels jaggy at this point, just a guy. 19th is Jonathan India. 20th is Jeff McNeil. India's another one, Scott. He kind of fits into that Brandon Lau, Jorge Polanco mold. I don't know that the upside is as high as those guys, but if he can bounce back in terms of health, that goes a long way to helping out this position, because no matter which way you want to slice it, you look at the numbers from this year and especially the StatCast numbers. I don't know that Jonathan India was ever healthy this year. So I kind of
Yeah,
give him a pass.
yeah, that may be fair, and I'm doing that to some degree by ranking him as high as 19th. But big difference between him and guys like Ketel Marte and Brandon Lau is that we all really had reason to be skeptical of India's performance, because it was, not very impressive underlying stats to back up that Rookie of the Year performance. And for the stretches he was supposedly healthy this year, he basically did nothing. And especially concerning to me was that he wasn't even getting on base anymore. He wasn't a great hitter in the minors, Jonathan India, but one thing he always did, including in his rookie season, was walk a lot. And if he wasn't even doing that, I don't know. It seems like the floor is awfully low for Jonathan India, but I'd be fine with him as a middle infield option late.
All right. Well, I hope you're wrong, because I have him in the Scott White Dynasty League.
I have him in a dynasty league too, so
Yeah.
I have him in a couple actually. So I hope for good things from Jonathan India as well. But it was a very discouraging second season, and it's just kind of a cross your fingers type of pick for a player with questionable skills as it is.
All right. Well, let's recap the top 20, 1 through 5. Jose Altuve, Marcus Semien, Ozzy Albies, Jazz Chisholm, and Trevor Story. 6 through 10, Tommy Edman, Andres Gimenez, Max Muncy, Ketel Marte, Jorge Polanco. 11 through 15, Brandon Lau, Brandon Drury, Gleyber Torres, John Birdie, Jay Cronenworth. 16 through 20, DJ LeMahieu, Gene Segura, Brendan Rodgers, Jonathan India, and Jeff McNeil. That is for 5x5 Roto Leagues. What changes in head-to-head points? Max Muncy, Jay Cronenworth, DJ LeMahieu get a bit of a boost, and Luis Arraez also jumps inside the top 20. John Birdie, no surprise there, he falls outside of the top 20. We're going to wrap there. For Scott, I am Frank. Thank you all for listening and watching Fantasy Baseball today. We'll be back again on Thursday. Bye-bye.